Okay, well, let's pick up again. Now we are moving toward a resolution of this. I just think it's, this is one of these areas where you look at the biblical teaching and you go, wow, how does this make sense? How can both be true at the same time? And it's one of the joys of theology is this effort to put the pieces together. That's just really some of the tremendous fun, the joy, the pleasure, the delight, and the satisfaction is in seeing when it goes together. Wow, it just is beautiful. Makes sense. So we're heading there. So we've looked at these two categories of biblical teachings that relate to the question, can an unbeliever understand the truth when the truth is brought to him? And one set of passages would say, oh yes, he gets it, he understands it, but he doesn't like it. He doesn't find it appealing. Just the opposite, he finds it objectionable. So a moral revulsion, moral resistance, moral antipathy. But another set of passages would indicate when truth comes to an unbeliever, he can't see it. He can't get it. He can't understand it. He's ignorant of it. So how in the world do you put these together? Okay, that's where we're moving on now to capital letter C. 3 paradigms regarding coming to know revealed truth. 3 paradigms for coming to know revealed truth. Now these are terms that come from the discipline of epistemology in philosophy. And I think they're just helpful in terms of kind of categories of understanding what we've been looking at and how to see the resolution to the question that is in front of us. Three ways that people have proposed what it means to know the revealed truth of God. The first one of these is a position that has been called fideism. Fideism, taking from the Latin term fides, which is to believe. And this view was strongly promoted, for example, by Karl Barth. Karl Barth believed himself that the truth of God's revelation could not be understood by an unbeliever who stood outside of the context of the Christian faith. That only if you are in the faith can you then understand the content of the faith. But you have to get into the faith first before you can understand the content of the faith. The ministry and writings of Cornelius Van Til have been somewhat similar. I think Barth is stronger than Van Til was, but Cornelius Van Til is another example of someone who has argued that it's only if you accept the correct presuppositions, God exists, the Bible is His Word, only then can you understand truth. Otherwise, you work from presuppositions that will always lead you astray. You can't understand it. So that there is this fideist tradition, and for Karl Barth, this was it caused a particular problem for him as he taught in the German university setting, because the German university, and this would be true of other universities as well, believed that all of the disciplines of the university dealt with information that was accessible to anybody else. Now, maybe you're not expert in that other discipline, but nonetheless, it doesn't deal with something that is privatized, that only those people can understand and talk about, that you could enter into that discussion too if you learn some of the basics of the discipline and the like. But here is this teacher in the university, Karl Barth, who is saying that only if you're a believer can you understand. And so it really, in many people's minds, it raised the question of whether the discipline of theology should be part of the university or whether it should be separated from it. And so there was some serious discussion about that in the time period that Karl Barth was prominent teaching in the university system in Germany. So this fideist view then really would argue you can't know the truth until you are in the faith. And it seems to me that kind of an approach, when you think of the passages that we have looked at together, would account for one side of biblical teaching, but not the other side of it, right? So they would do very well with the spiritual blindness passages, the passages that indicate that there is a fundamental ignorance, that there is a blindness, that you aren't able to see or understand what is there. They could account for that, but it's very difficult to see how the fideist position could account for the moral antipathy passages. What does it mean you get it but you don't like it? No, you can't get it, they would say. So it accounts for one but not the other. Well, here's another position in epistemology that has appeared many times throughout history. It's called rationalism. Rationalism. And this view would hold that really, if you use your reason correctly, you can know any truth that is brought to you, as long as you function according to the canons of logic and use reason in the proper ways, you can understand. And a strong advocate of this position was Wolfhart Pannenberg, who was also a professor of theology in Germany who followed Karl Barth. And one of the burdens that Pannenberg had in the university system in Germany was to defend the legitimacy of the discipline of theology in the university. And he disagreed completely with Karl Barth's fideism, disagreed completely with the notion that unless you're in the faith, you cannot understand the revelation of God. And Pannenberg went the opposite direction and said, oh no, just the opposite. Anybody can understand the revelation of God. The problem isn't understanding it. The problem is accepting it as true and applying it to your life. But anybody can get it. And so Pannenberg's life and writing was marked by doing his theology, as it were, from below. Now, what this simply means is he tried to appeal to things that were empirically verifiable, that were evident to anybody who would want to look at the data that's out there and argue from that to a position theologically that matched what we have in divine revelation, showing that, yes, anybody can see that given these facts, given these elements of experience that we can all see, given that, then this theological truth must be affirmed. One of the books that really launched him into fame was a book entitled Jesus, God, and Man. And the way he defended the deity of Christ was by demonstrating the historical veracity of the resurrection of Christ, appealing to history, historical features, the empty tomb, the appearances of Christ, and so on. By appealing to historical features, he defended the notion that indeed Christ rose from the dead. By the way, it's still one of the best defenses of the literal historicity of the resurrection that there is available. And why did he bother with that? Well, because he wanted to make this point, that if in fact Jesus did rise from the dead, then we ought to take seriously and believe the things that he said. And among the things that he said was, I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am, which are assertions of his deity. So because of what we know from history, namely that Christ, the only explanation that makes sense of what we see in history is that Christ in fact did rise from the dead, only because of that, or because of that evidence, we conclude he really was who he claimed to be. And his claims have to be taken seriously, which indicate his deity. So from below, you reason up to, he is God, rather than starting above the declaration from the Bible, he is God, and moving down, You go from below up, says Pannenberg. So his whole approach was to say, hey, this is open and accessible to anybody. Anybody can see the evidence and come to the conclusion that Jesus, in fact, has been raised from the dead and that he is then the Son of God. And Pannenberg loved the fact that one of his Jewish colleagues there at the university where he taught read his defense of the resurrection of Christ and agreed with him. Indeed, Jesus did rise from the dead. That is by far and away the best explanation of the historical facts that are present. Indeed, he did. But then this Jewish man did not go the next step and affirm then that he was the Son of God. But Pannenberg said, see, it works. You could appeal to data, to empirical data, and support then what theology is wanting to affirm. And you can do this in a way that even people who don't have the Spirit, who aren't saved, they can see that and understand that. So Pannenberg then represents the rationalist element, of this, and it seems like he then would be someone who could account well for the moral antipathy passages in the New Testament, right? People can see it. They can. They just don't like it. He can account for those, but he cannot account for the spiritual blindness passages. They don't make sense because people can get it. They can get it. So why would you say they can't? Because they are able to. So the key is, how can you put the two together? Well, in the discipline of epistemology, there has developed a kind of a hybrid of the two, of the rationalism and the fideism, or a way to take the best of both and discard the worst, in a view that has often been called critical realism. Critical realism is a view that we really can know what is true. We can see the truth for what it is, and that's the realist side of the phrase. Realism meaning we really can understand what the truth is when it comes to us. But it's critical realism, namely, but that truth that comes to us is filtered by our minds, which have certain pre-understandings, presuppositions, certain commitments, certain values that will inevitably affect whether we find that truth acceptable or not. In other words, there are commitments that we have, traditions that we have, background that is true of us that will cause us to assess the truth as we receive it, to really decide whether or not we should believe that as true and accept it or not. So this critical realism view really tried to say that the rationalist side is correct, namely insofar as we can understand what is given to us, but it also argued that the fideist side is correct too, that our beliefs matter, that if we're not in the faith, we don't really see it fully for what it is. Okay, now, so that critical realism position that has become quite dominant in philosophy and in epistemology, it seems to me, helps us understand where we need to come down on these passages of Scripture. Now, let me show you this. Go back with me to those two passages in particular, Ephesians 4 and 1 Corinthians 2, and I want to think about them with you yet one more time. First of all, Ephesians 4, and it's the progression of the way Paul develops this that I think is so instructive. Beginning again at verse 17, Paul says, "So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer as the Gentiles walked, in the futility of their mind." So there's something about their minds that right now you would say is futile. They're just not thinking the right way. They're not thinking in a way that advances truth. Futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. So we see them as being ignorant, darkened. They're futile in the way they think, in their minds. But then notice the next phrase in verse 18. Because of the hardness of their heart. So it seems to me that really the causal relationship, you have to work back the other direction in the passage. You work from the bottom of verse 18 up. It's the hardness of heart that leads to ignorance, darkened understanding, and futility of their mind. But it's the hardness of heart that begins the process that leads to this ignorance and darkness. In other words, it is the fact that truth has been given to them that they don't like, they don't want, that leads them to reject the truth as truth. Hence, they are ignorant of the truth as truth because they find it repulsive. It doesn't mean they haven't seen it and they haven't responded to it. Indeed, they have. They have responded in a way that is marked by hardness of their heart. They don't like it. They won't go there. They will not accept it. But that results then in their inability to see it as it really is. And instead they see other things as true, and they go that direction with it, futility of their mind, and so on. So it seems to me then that it indicates that the moral antipathy is the cause of spiritual blindness, right? That they are in a position where they don't see the truth as it is because they have rejected the truth. The moral antipathy is what gives rise to the ignorance, the darkness, the hardness. The hardness gives rise to the darkness in their own lives. Now, look also at 1 Corinthians 2. 2 Corinthians 4. 2 Corinthians 4, because I think we see here also something that is really instructive. At least I have found this instructive. Notice that Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4, concerning all who are perishing, so this is all unbelievers, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they might not see. Now look at what it is they cannot see. They cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Now, I remember when I was working on this, when I didn't know, what answer I was going to come up with or what the Lord would help me with on this, I was really puzzled by this for quite some time, and praying and asking the Lord for help with this. And what came to my mind as I was meditating on this text is that what really they are blind to is not Christ per se, but what they're blind to is the glory of Christ. They cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. And that led me to begin thinking this way. Boy, think of people during Jesus' day who rejected Him, and so on. Here's my question. Could they actually see Jesus? Let's start physically. Let's start at the most basic level. Could they see the person who stood among them and walked and spoke and did different things? Could they see Him physically? Well, of course they could. Of course they could. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. Could they understand things that He said? That is, people who rejected Christ. Could they understand what He said? And where you would say, yeah, they get it. They understand it. Yes, in many cases. Now, your mind might have gotten right away to the parables where Jesus says that He's speaking in parables precisely to keep these things from others. But there are so many instances where we realize, yes, they understood what Jesus meant by what He said. So, for example, when He says, I and the Father are one, what did they do in response? They took up stones to stone Him, right, for blasphemy, because they understood the claim. He's claiming to be one with God, one with the Father. That is an atrocious statement They judged one that was deserving of stoning to death because it was blasphemy. So did they understand what he meant when he said, I and the Father are one? Did they understand what he meant when he said, before Abraham was, I am? Oh, yes. They understood it, and they did not like it. They found that so offensive. Okay, let me take it one step further. Could they see and understand the miracles that he performed? Well, at least in many cases, it seems the answer is yes. I mean, for example, in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus healed a man who was demon-possessed, a very remarkable miracle, evidently, because the Pharisees who witnessed this, they were there to see it. They couldn't deny a miracle had happened, and so their only option, if something supernatural has happened, but we don't want to say that he's from God, what's the other option? Well, he does what he does by the power of Satan, right? So they conclude he casts out demons by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. Okay, so did they get it that he performed a miracle? Yes. I mean, it's not as though they were blinded to this and they thought this was a magic act, some kind of sleight of hand. No, they didn't do that. They knew a miracle took place. So what is it, if they could see Christ physically, if they could hear his words and understand what he said, if they could see deeds that he did, miracles that he performed, and understand that he did those things, what is it they could not see? And the answer is they could not see the glory of Christ. They could not see Christ for who he truly is. So you might put it this way. They could see the truth, but they could not see the truth as truth that they would then celebrate and embrace as their own. They could see the truth, but they could not see the truth as truth that they would celebrate and embrace as their own. Instead, when confronted with the truth, they saw it, but how did they respond? They hated it. They rejected it. They were repulsed by it. So can you see then that their moral antipathy resulted in a kind of spiritual blindness? Blindness of what? They could not see Christ for who he truly is, for the glory of Christ, of his own nature as one who truly is from God, who comes as the God-man and Savior of the world. They could not see that because the ignorance then was the byproduct of their moral revulsion. So I think this fits exactly the same thing we saw in Ephesians 4, that the foolishness of their minds and the darkness, and the darkness and the ignorance is a result of their hardness of heart. And similarly, I think when you consider Jesus' own life and ministry, it was the rejection by those Pharisees and teachers of the law, the repulsion that they had toward Christ, that resulted in they cannot see the truth as truth, and so embrace it and accept it for their own lives. So I think this is really helpful to understand, because it does mean when we present the gospel and we speak to unbelievers, that we can be confident that there is at least a level of understanding that we can have with them and expect them to see. When we're speaking words, they can understand what those words mean. If we're talking about Christ dying for sinners, they can understand what those words mean. But what it requires for them to see that truth as truth is the Spirit to work within, to open blind eyes, to see now the truth for what it is. Before they had seen the truth for what it is not, something objectionable, something terrible, this aroma of death to death. They don't like this, they don't want it. But now by the Spirit they see that very same truth and they say, oh my, this is precious, this is glorious, this is beautiful. Thank you so much for this truth that you have enabled me now to see rightly for what it is. So we can depend upon the fact people can hear and understand what we're saying. But whether they see it rightly for what it really is depends upon the work of the Spirit in their lives. This is why we pray, for the Lord to do a work that only He can do in the lives of others. Is bring them spiritual sight to be able to respond in ways that are fitting to the truth rather than to reject it. Now go back one more second to 1 Corinthians chapter 2 again, and I want you to see, I think then this one verse really does explain both sides of it. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14. A natural man, the person who does not have the Spirit, so he's not saved, a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. That is, they are only understood rightly through the power of the Spirit. So do you see the logic of what he's saying here? Because the unbeliever sees the truth given as foolishness. So here is the category of moral antipathy. Because he views the truth that is presented to him as foolish. He doesn't want it, doesn't like it, doesn't agree with it, doesn't want to accept it. Well, then he doesn't accept it. Verse 14a, he doesn't accept the things because they're foolishness to him. And what's the result of that? He cannot understand them. Now, I don't think that means he cannot understand anything about it. There's an absolute absence of any understanding. I don't think that's the point he's making, but rather he cannot understand those truths for what they really are. Glorious truth. He cannot see the truth as truth and accept it. He sees the truth as something repulsive. So he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. If he's going to understand them, he has to have the Spirit to enable him to have that understanding as his eyes are open to see it. And then, of course, he contrasts that with the person who has the Spirit in verse 15. But he who is spiritual, simply meaning the person who is a believer who has the Spirit in his life, appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no one. In other words, he is able then, by the Spirit, to assess what is true and what is not, and embrace what is true and reject what is false, because the Spirit is giving him guidance in this. And indeed, he has that capacity that an unbeliever does not have because he does not have the Spirit. So don't be surprised when unbelievers hate the truth that we proclaim, when you think, well, don't you understand what I'm saying? Oh yeah, we understand it. We get exactly what you're saying, and we don't accept it. We find it ridiculous. Don't be surprised, because the problem may be, there are times when the problem may be that you're not communicating it correctly, accurately, clearly. That can be. You need to always check to see if that's the problem. Are we communicating these things accurately that represent the truth of God to them? But then, that may not be the fundamental problem. The problem probably is a moral one, a moral antipathy to that truth. They see it, they just don't like it, and won't come until God does a work in their life by the Spirit to see it now as truth rather than to see it as hideous. To smell it now, that fragrance, as life to life, instead of smelling the fragrance as they did before of death to death. So indeed, the importance of the work of the Spirit then. So back to the definition at the very beginning. Remember my partisan definition. This is why I wrote it the way I did. Illumination refers to the work of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, by which He renders the truth of the Scriptures more fully understandable. Now that, I struggled with the best way to convey what I've just been unpacking for you, But more fully understandable indicates there's some level of understanding of kind of the basic idea of that truth that they get. But what they don't see is the fullness of that truth, the truth of the truth, the beauty, the glory of that truth apart from the Spirit. So the Spirit, by which the Spirit renders the truth more fully understandable and applicable in an individual's life. So praise be to God for the Spirit who opens our eyes to see the truth for what it is, and we come. Apart from which we would always reject that truth, find it repulsive, and turn away from it.